In part 3 of my series on now disgraced legendary director Shane Carruth, I'll be discussing his last produced film, 2013's Upstream Color. And the first thing of note about Upstream Color is that there was a 9-year gap between Primer in 2004 and Upstream Color, which wasn't released until 2013. And you might be wondering why that is. Well, after Primer was released in 2004 and was kind of the Sundance darling, Shane had a lot of heat, and he had a lot of different ideas on where to go next. And originally, he wanted to produce a kind of romantic, epic sea adventure about shipping lanes called A Modern Ocean, but scrapped that pretty early on and decided to focus instead on the mind-bending sci-fi script A Topiary, which I discuss at length as the first part of my series pinned in my profile. In the nearly 10 years between Primer and Upstream Color, A Topiary was Shane's baby. It was everything to him. And he got close many times with David Fincher and Steven Soderbergh being attached, and ultimately it just kind of fell through over a lot of different circumstances. And so eventually Shane just decided, screw it, I don't like how the financing works in Hollywood, so I'm gonna go back to my roots and make something low budget. And Upstream Color is basically almost entirely self-funded, outside of a couple like friends and family. And before I spoil basically the entire movie, because it's very complicated, I'll answer the question, is it worth watching? Does it hold up to something like Primer? And I think, yeah, it definitely is worth watching, although I'm not quite as big a fan of Primer. In many ways, it's like a sister movie where Primer was more left-brained and this is more right-brained. It's got a very Terrence Malick style to it, but there's obvious elements of Shane Carruth littered throughout it, specifically the mechanisms from which the plot unfolds. So the film starts off weird right off the bat with two of these teenage kids drinking a tea where they put a grub in it, and they start kind of like shadow boxing, except every movement is equally mirrored, giving a kind of weird psychic connection to the tea, sort of. And from this, we see that the maggots are cultivated through this guy called the Thief, who looks in a flower shop, and when he sees a blue orchid or like blue tinted of these worms, he takes them and puts them into capsules. And later on at night, kind of like a rug dealer, he hangs out and looks for potential prey, which he finds in a woman and he eventually finds his victim in Chris, played by Amy Simmons, where we see what he was doing with these worms. He tases her, and as she's unconscious, he ingests this worm into her body. And we see the following week unfold with the Thief and Chris in her house. She's kind of in this sort of trance, and it appears that the effects of these worms or parasites lead the victim to be very suggestible. And the Thief recites these kind of lines as if he's done this like many, many times, where it's like, my face is the color of the sun, so you can't look at it, and also don't eat anything, and you have to be rewarded ice water, which you think is like the most delicious thing in the world. But in order to do that, you have to do something for him, which is you basically have to sign away all of your financial assets and anything of value in the house. And in between these actions, she's making these kind of like paper chain where she transcribes Walden and then folds it up into these kind of weird objects. But once the Thief kind of has what he needs, she's kind of left alone, and because she hasn't eaten in what's about a week, she ravages the fridge. And after eating, it seems to have grown the parasite into a more mature and much more horrifying creature that she can literally see in her skin. She attempts to extract it, but fails. But she's drawn to a mysterious location by some sort of sound. By this guy, a pig farmer who's known as the Sampler. And so the Sampler hooks up Chris to a pig and transfers the parasites from her into the pig. And from that point on, it seems like the pig's feelings and Chris's feelings have like a definite like psychic like connection. And in the aftermath of all this procedure, she's kind of blacked out. Like, she doesn't understand what happened. She has no memory of any of these events, and she's left without any money and without a job. That is until she's kind of drawn to and kind of has a weird meet cute type situation with Shane Carruth's character, Jeff. And at this time, we realize kind of why the Sampler is doing this with the pig extraction. Because as he gets closer to the pigs, we realize that when he does get near them, he's kind of transported in a weird way to see the lives of the people from which the parasites originally were hosted in. and kind of is a voyeur into their like joys and traumas and just general existence. It's very eerie. And so Chris and Jeff start developing more of like a codependent style relationship, but because they've been infected by these parasites, they seem to have like this hole in their lives. They're kind of basically rebuilding from scratch. And this is kind of like the point of the movie, I think, to Shane, or at least what was the genesis for the idea. In that, in much of the same way that Primer was like kind of catalyzed by his fascination with what would happen if trust was like severely broken in a friendship, could it ever be like reconciled? Upstream Color deals with a kind of personal obsession of his of like, are you just the memories and the artifacts of like your past life? And what would happen if they were, I don't know, erased? Would you be able to build back up? Is there some sort of ontologically true essence of your personality that would just kind of emerge over time, even if everything else was erased? And I think his answer to that, and what got him writing, as he says, is that what if the answer is no? What if like you just have to rebuild entirely new personality, an entirely new life, if something like this was to occur? And so this is the situation where Chris and Jeff like find themselves. And we're cut away with Chris like digging rocks from a pool and reciting poems, oddly enough. And through our conversations, we see Jeff's character also building these kind of chains, implying that, yeah, he too was also a victim of this parasite. But what's really interesting is that over time, because these two are getting closer together, they start actually mixing up their own memories, and they start having arguments about like whose childhood memory belongs to whose like friend was whose, etc., and it becomes very disorienting very quickly. But the sampler notices that like their two corresponding pigs are like basically attached at the hip, and eventually one of the pigs gets pregnant, which leads to Chris herself thinking she's pregnant, even going as far as to test positive for a pregnancy test. But she goes to the hospital and they say, no, you're not pregnant. In fact, you actually have like structural internal damage that suggests that you have some sort of ovarian cancer, but that it doesn't exist anymore, but unfortunately you'll never be able to have children. But her pig actually is pregnant, which is why she feels this way, and has a litter of piglets, which the sampler is kind of annoyed about because he views them as kind of like a defect. He can't actually peer into their lives like he can with the other pigs. So he takes them in a burlap sack and kind of dumps them into a river, leading to like an immense distress and psychological trauma from both Chris and Jeff, who feel this loss like on a physical level and end up holding themselves in a bathroom, like hugging each other in grief for a very long period of time. At this point, we sort of get a preview of like how this whole life cycle happens. As the piglets decay, a blue liquid kind of seeps out of them and into the roots of a plant. But when Jeff observes Chris doing this kind of pool ritual where she recites words and collects stones from the bottom, he too recognizes the things that she says, and he writes them down and eventually finds out that it's from Walden and that this must be connected somehow. And so ultimately, they're led by their kind of like psychic intuition from the pigs to the sampler's farm, from which Chris unalives the sampler. And they realize that the sampler has files on all of the other pigs and their requisite hosts that had the parasite to begin with. So they send him care packages with all the information, their pig, and Walden book, to which they all return to the same farm, painted yellow, and kind of set the pigs free, finally being at peace. And before this, we see how the worm life cycle works. So when the piglets are discarded, the blue particles seep into the roots of these orchids that are originally white, but once they're exposed to this kind of blue chemical, some of them turn blue. Those blue orchids are bought to a flower shop where the thief then inspects them for maggots, collects them, and uses those to do this type of, thievery, for lack of a better term. The sampler then uses these sounds to collect these parasites into the pig, and uses the pigs as a kind of musical inspiration, voyeuring on other people's emotional lives. But because the pigs are free and they're no longer being discarded into the river, the movie concludes with the fact that the workers who originally picked the blue orchids no longer see any more blue. And when the thief goes to inspect at the flower shop, he doesn't find any grubs. And that's more or less what happens in Upstream Color. A very, very interesting and ethereal film, much more sentimental than Primer, but in my opinion, not my favorite. Good, but not great. And I'd love to hear what you think in the comments. Next up, I'll be tackling the Modern Ocean screenplay and also the disgraced allegations of Shane Carruth himself.